Have you ever imagined what it would be like to have your entire life judged in an instant? What would you do if you were suddenly treated like a criminal in front of the people you love most without even understanding why? This is no ordinary story. It's not something that happens every day, but it could happen to you or someone you know. Stay with me, because what you're going to discover now could completely change the way you see the people around you. It was a peaceful afternoon, one of those that seems in no hurry to end. The warm sun gently entered through the living room curtain, illuminating a peaceful scene. A small table, 2 cups of tea, and a couple in their 70s, living a simple routine full of small, happy details. Nothing there indicated that something was about to break that peace in a brutal way. And then, in a flash, everything changed. Violent knocks echoed through the front door, breaking the silence in the house. The sound was eerily familiar, heavy, urgent, demanding immediate attention. Police department, open the door. Have you ever felt those butterflies in your stomach when you realize something is terribly wrong? That's exactly what they felt at that moment. The veteran, a man with more than 7 decades of life and many scars kept in silence, calmly stood up. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He didn't resist. He just walked to the door, slowly opened it, and found himself facing 3 agents, guns pointed directly at him. "Hands where I can see them! Now!" one of the officers shouted, voice full of authority. The wife's heart raced, and she put her hands to her mouth, completely in shock. The man in front of her was someone she had known for over 50 years, someone incapable of hurting even a fly. What could justify such violence? With serenity that almost bordered on defiance, the veteran raised his hands. Her calm, steady eyes showed an unexpected strength that contrasted with her simple robe and gray hair. Even in the face of that humiliating situation, there was dignity in his eyes. But the scene became even more intense when the police officer in front advanced, pointing his finger in a threatening tone, firing a sentence that echoed through the room like a physical blow. "Step back, old man, or you're next." It was like a slap in the face to everyone present. The gratuitous aggression seemed absurd, unnecessary, almost cruel. But in that instant, the veteran, whose calm never wavered, did not retreat. On the contrary, he looked directly into the policeman's eyes, took a deep breath, and then said just 5 words. 5 short, precise, enigmatic words. Words that made the police officer hesitate, that froze the movements of everyone around. No one understood exactly what they meant at that moment, but something about that tone of voice, that firmness, revealed a hidden strength. Have you ever been through this? Have you ever had to prove who you really are when no one believed you? So, you know how every second of this tension can last an eternity. And for that veteran, that eternity was just beginning. Because those 5 words were not just words. They were a trigger for something much bigger, something no one in that room could predict or imagine. Something that was not just in that man's memory, but written deeply in the forgotten pages of his history. Stay here with me, because what happens next will completely change this narrative. What is about to be revealed may surprise you more than you imagine. The 5 words spoken by the veteran still echoed in the room like an indecipherable mystery. One of the police officers instinctively took a step back, disconcerted by the gentleman's unexpected calm and firmness. The heavy silence seemed to last minutes, even though it was only seconds. The wife, feeling the emotional weight of the moment, leaned against the wall, struggling to breathe in the face of the fear and humiliation that now invaded the home where so many beautiful memories had been built. With his hands still raised, the veteran felt the cold of the handcuffs being slowly placed on his wrists, a humiliating sensation he never imagined he would experience after a lifetime dedicated to protecting the freedom of others. His wife let out a choked sob, trying to hold back her tears as she watched her husband be treated like a criminal. The expression on the veteran's face remained serene, but his eyes held a deep sadness. Not for himself, but for her, for the woman he had promised to protect since returning from the war. While one of the police officers quickly read him his rights, in a mechanical and distant tone, neighbors began to gather in the street. Through the window, frightened and incredulous faces watched the unbelievable scene taking place in that house that until then was synonymous with respect and serenity. Some murmured, others discreetly took photos, shocked by the absurd situation unfolding before them. Have you ever felt the unbearable weight of an injustice? Have you ever had to swallow humiliation in silence, without even having the chance to explain yourself? If this topic makes sense to you, leave here in the comments what has touched you most so far. Because every story, every word shared, strengthens the message that no one deserves to be judged hastily, and your voice makes all the difference. Meanwhile, the veteran's wife was removed from the room by one of the agents, who tried to ensure that she did not interfere in the operation. She trembled from head to toe, overcome by a feeling of helplessness, without understanding how this absurd situation had gotten there. "He never hurt anyone," she pleaded in tears, seeking understanding in the cold eyes of the police officers. But his words found no shelter there. Outside, the crowd slowly grew. The atmosphere of tension seemed to spread to nearby houses, taking over each resident who tried to understand what could justify such violence against a man so peaceful and admired in the neighborhood. There were many questions, but no one seemed to have answers. At this point in the story, you may be wondering, why is it so important to like this video or subscribe to the channel? Because by doing so, you are telling the world that stories like this matter, that respect, honor, and dignity always deserve to be defended. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with content that really makes a difference. The police car parked on the sidewalk now had its doors open, ready to take him away. The veteran struggled to look back at his wife before being led out the door. In his eyes was a mute apology, not out of real guilt, but for being unable to protect her from that humiliation. The officers pushed him gently but firmly enough to make it clear who was in control. As the car door slowly closed, something unexpected caught everyone's attention. A young police officer, perhaps the youngest among them, noticed a detail that everyone had ignored until then. On the coffee table, an old photo showed the veteran next to an American president. His face paled as he realized that maybe, just maybe, they were making a very serious mistake. And at that moment, as the car's engine started, he made a silent decision that would change everything that came next. The room that, until minutes before, seemed like a sanctuary of peace, now turned into a field of emotional warfare. The still steaming cups of tea had been knocked to the floor. The sound of hot liquid running down the tiles mixed with the dry noise of furniture being pushed. Familiar photographs trembled on the walls with each sudden step taken by the police, as if even the memories inside were being threatened. The veteran's wife, a fragile-looking woman, but with eyes that held decades of companionship, screamed for explanations. She couldn't understand how someone who never raised his voice even to her was now treated like a high-risk criminal. "He's a good man," she repeated, almost begging, grabbing the arm of one of the agents. But no look of compassion came in response. Only orders, screams, and the cruel coldness of someone who learned to obey before questioning. And then came the phrase that fell like a sentence. "He is being investigated for involvement in illegal international operations." Time seemed to stop. The words echoed through the house like gunshots. The veteran's wife fell to her knees on the floor, her hands shaking. She murmured between sobs that it could only be a mistake. That he didn't even leave the house anymore. That he spent his days reading old newspapers and taking care of the plants in the yard. What kind of threat could he pose? But no one listened. Not really. Because at that time, he was no longer a man. It was just a target. A number on a report. The veteran, handcuffed and still silent, looked at a fixed point on the wall. But inside, something had been triggered. An ancient image began to take shape in his mind, as if rising from the cracks of memory. The smell of hot sand, the sound of gunfire in the distance, the whir of a helicopter descending too quickly, and the voice of a soldier shouting, "Major, they're surrounding the village!" He didn't blink. It didn't move. But it was far from there. Returning to a place where split-second decisions separated life from death. Where he was not just a husband, but responsible for keeping more than 20 men under his command alive. His every command was a chance, each silence a sentence. One of the younger police officers began to observe in silence. There was something different about this man. It wasn't the way he stood firm, even in the face of aggression. It was the way he breathed, as if he was trained to withstand pressure. As if this wasn't the first time someone had pointed a gun at him. And maybe it wasn't even the worst. The young agent didn't say anything, but his gaze was no longer the same as his colleagues. Meanwhile, the veteran's wife tried to explain what she didn't know. She repeated in a choked voice that he could not be involved in anything illegal. That in recent years, I barely had the strength to climb the ladder. Who spent sleepless nights, haunted by nightmares that she never had the courage to ask about? She knew he carried secrets, but he never imagined they were those. Her pain was almost unbearable to watch. It was the pain of impotence. To see the love of your life come undone in just a few minutes, before eyes that never really knew him. It was like seeing an entire story ripped out of your heart and thrown on the floor next to the broken cups. And it is at this point that I ask you, to what extent can a life be disfigured by hasty judgments? How often does someone's calm appearance hide a field of entire battles, fought in silence? Write it in the comments. Not everything is what it seems. Because sometimes what is being carried on someone's shoulders goes far beyond what the eyes can see. And as the young police officer looked at that old photograph on the wall of a man in a military uniform shaking hands with an authority figure, he began to get suspicious. It wasn't just the name that seemed familiar. It was the posture, the firmness, the expression of someone who has commanded more than can be counted. In his head, something was starting to come together, but not completely. It was still just a whisper, and that whisper was about to turn into an impossible-to-ignore scream. The sound of the handcuffs closing on the veteran's wrists sounded louder than any scream. It was a dry, cold, almost cruel crack which echoed between the walls of the house like an affront. His wife, still on her knees, let out a choked moan. It wasn't just pain. It was shame, helplessness, and that terrible feeling that everything that had been built in silence for a lifetime was being crushed in minutes, before eyes that knew nothing about who he really was. The police lifted him up with a certain brutality, as if he were a threat, completely ignoring the fragility that age and years of silent suffering had placed on his bones. But even in the face of that humiliating scene, he said nothing. He didn't ask. He didn't beg. He just kept his head up, his eyes fixed on the void, as if he were trying to maintain his dignity glued to the body that the system insisted on stripping of respect. And then, at the exact moment the lieutenant turned to walk him out of the house, the voice came, firm, controlled, almost emotionless, but with a weight that made the room freeze. "Call General Rohr, right now." It was as if a stone had been thrown into a calm lake. The impact was immediate. A dense silence took over the environment. The lieutenant turned slowly, looking at the old man with disdain, like someone who doubts, but also like someone who feels something out of place. A peace out of place, a certainty that is beginning to sway. "Sorry. What did you say?" he asked, his face contorted between disbelief and arrogance. The veteran didn't look away. His eyes, aged but still sharp, bored into that freshly ironed uniform as if he knew exactly what was behind it. He repeated, with a calm that seemed rehearsed, "He'll want to talk to me." In that instant, something changed. Not on the set. The furniture was still out of place. The wife was still crying silently near the wall. But in the air. An invisible discomfort passed between the agents, as if a hidden truth began to forcefully emerge, breaking the surface of a poorly told narrative. Meanwhile, in the hallway, the youngest police officer, the same one who had noticed the old man's strange posture, entered the back room. Curiosity was greater than order. And it was there, in the dimly lit room, between dusty books and a chest full of old memorabilia, that he saw the frame. The image paralyzed his eyes. A black and white portrait, in a position of honor. The veteran, much younger, in an impeccable decorated uniform. At his side, nothing less than an American president. Shaking your hand, smiling at him, The caption below said it all. Honor Ceremony. Recognition for Delta Operative Operation 1983. The agent took a deep breath. The heart started to beat faster. He looked again. It was clear. It wasn't a mistake. That man in handcuffs in the room was someone the history books had mentioned, but who time had buried beneath wrinkles, silence, and prejudice. And then, as if obeying a greater force, the house's landline phone rang. An old, metallic, insistent sound. A phone that hadn't been used in a long time. Maybe years. But now, he played. As if he knew the right time to interrupt what was about to happen. The younger officer ran back into the room, but stopped in the hallway. Something stopped him from continuing. Maybe it was the weight of the revelation. Maybe it was the fear of having gone too far. But there, on the threshold between doubt and conviction, he knew. They were not facing just any suspect. They were faced with a man who had already given everything, including silence, for the country that was now handcuffing him. The woman, still sitting on the floor, saw the phone ringing and whispered, almost breathlessly, "It's him." He always said that if one day it was necessary, he would know. She looked at her husband with a mixture of love and reverence. It was as if she was seeing, for the first time in a long time, not the man she had slept with for decades, but the warrior she swore to love, even without knowing everything he had faced. The pieces started to move, and maybe that's what we forget. That time doesn't erase someone's value. That silence does not mean absence. That there are stories that don't fit into the eyes, but that shape the soul of those who lived them. Comment there. There are truths that time cannot erase. Because what was about to be revealed wasn't just about a forgotten past. It was about a forcibly hidden legacy, ready to emerge, inevitably. The phone rang with an old, sharp, almost symbolic sound. It was as if that device knew exactly when to wake up, after so long in silence. The lieutenant, still trying to maintain his composure in the face of the old man's unusual order, didn't even move. But it was the youngest police officer, the same one who had discovered the photo with the president, who answered with his hands shaking and his gaze already transformed by what he had just seen. He barely managed to complete the sentence when he heard the voice on the other end of the line. General Rohr's office. Who's speaking? There was a pause, the kind that weighs more than any direct answer. The agent took a deep breath and released the veteran's name, as if delivering a truth that could no longer be hidden. On the other end of the line, silence. Then, just a strong, restrained breath, as if it were the harbinger of a storm about to break. Release this man, now! The order was spoken with a firmness that went through the telephone cord like lightning. And even then, the lieutenant hesitated. His hardened eyes looked to his colleagues, seeking support, but all he found were doubts and discomfort. The authority he carried seemed to slip through his fingers, like wet sand. He tried to stand his ground. I still believed I was in control. That it was all just a misunderstanding. Or maybe, deep down, he just didn't want to admit that he had crossed the line in front of someone who deserved honors, not handcuffs. Meanwhile, outside, something was approaching. The serious noise of tires on the asphalt broke the silence of the neighborhood. 2 black vehicles, dark windows, stopped in front of the house. It was like a scene taken from another time, as if the past had put its uniform back on and was coming to claim everything that had been forgotten. The car doors opened at the same time, and from them came figures that could not be confused with civilians. Ex-military. Men and women who walked with the same kind of rectitude that the veteran had demonstrated since the beginning of the approach. One of them wore a wrinkled jacket with a press badge hanging around his neck. A local reporter who covered cases of injustice and had a keen nose for stories the government preferred to keep buried. But what caught the most attention was the last one to get off. A man in uniform, tall, with a rigid posture, and on his chest. Rare insignia, some that few would recognize. Medals from ancient campaigns, badges from special commands, seals that demanded more than bravery. They demanded survival, strategy, sacrifice. In the room, the police no longer knew what to do. The presence of the reporter raised the alarm. The lieutenant, now visibly uncomfortable, tried to order no one to open the door. But no one obeyed, because something stronger than hierarchy was already taking over that place. The weight of truth. The doorbell didn't ring. The man in uniform simply knocked on the door firmly. And when the veteran's wife approached to answer, he didn't wait any longer. He raised his right hand, palm open, and placed it on his chest in a sign of a military salute. I didn't say a word. But in that gesture, there was everything. Respect, recognition. Sorry for the delay. The woman opened the door with tears still in her eyes, but now mixed with something new. Relief. Relief to finally see someone who knew who her husband was. Relief knowing he wasn't alone anymore. Inside, the veteran remained silent. But for the first time, his eyes filled. Not out of fear, not even from pain, but from an emotion that he had kept for decades. It was a reunion with his own story. Confirmation that everything he lived, everything he sacrificed, had not been forgotten. Not completely. But the lieutenant, despite everything, still tried to maintain order. He shouted for protocols, threatened arrests, demanded justifications. But his words sounded hollow, disconnected from the reality that was now imposing itself like an avalanche. Because there are times when command changes hands without the need for speech. And that was one of them. The man in uniform entered. He stopped in front of the veteran, who was still handcuffed. The two looked at each other. There were no questions between them, just recognition. And in a low, firm voice, almost like a whisper, he said, "Major Grady, mission accomplished. You are free." The metallic noise of the handcuffs being removed was like the end of a nightmare. But no one celebrated there. Not yet. Because what was at stake was much bigger than an unjust arrest. That's what it said about how we treat those who have already given everything for us. It was about memory, about mentality, about the behind the scenes of the decisions we make without knowing what we are really doing. If this touched you in any way, comment below. I remember those who served. Because sometimes all a hero needs is to be remembered. And what would come after that would reveal more than the neighborhood ever imagined. The silence that fell over the room was almost sacred. Not an empty silence, but one that carried weight, memory, scars, and everything that was never said. The uniformed man took a step forward, his gaze fixed on the veteran who had just had his handcuffs removed. The words that came next changed the course of everything, as if he had just turned on a light too bright to continue ignoring the darkness. "This man is Major Thomas Grady. He saved my entire battalion in Kandahar." The voice was firm, but full of emotion. A mix of gratitude and shame. Gratitude for being alive. Shame for arriving so late. Thomas's eyes didn't twitch. But your chest does. That sentence, coming from someone he barely recognized, was like opening an ancient door locked from the inside. His breathing wavered for a moment. The years haven't made him immune to pain. They've just taught him to hold it in longer. No one in the room knew what to say. Even the lieutenant, who until then had commanded everything with an iron fist, was now motionless, almost pale. The arrogance was gone. Talking about orders and procedures no longer made any sense in light of the revelation. It was as if the entire structure he supported had crumbled beneath his feet. And then came what no one expected. The soldier who had arrived took out a thick envelope from inside his coat, crumpled at the edges, as if it had been kept for a long time. He extended it with both hands to the veteran. "Major, this was yours. It was issued over 30 years ago, but it never reached your hands. I found it in the barracks files when I was investigating the name that appeared today. It's an official recognition, the Medal of Valor, Gold Class." The report was hushed up. They said the operation couldn't be publicized, but now it can't be hidden anymore. Thomas looked at the envelope without touching it for a few seconds, as if he was afraid to open it. Fear that all this wasn't real. fear that it was still a piece of war, another trap, another sacrifice. But it wasn't. It was true. And it was there, in front of everyone. The reporter, who until then had been observing in silence, discreetly turned on the microphone. He knew he was facing something bigger than a complaint. It was a repair. A story with deep layers, full of poorly explained decisions, hidden truths, dark behind the scenes. But it was also an impactful story, which could transform the mentality of those who still think that heroes always wear capes or appear in the headlines. The young policeman, the same one who had hesitated from the beginning, approached slowly. He looked the veteran in the eye and just said, "I'm sorry." There was no response, just a slight shake of the head. That was enough. There were things that words couldn't fix, but the courage to admit them was a start. And then came the flash. Not in the room, but in everyone's mind. A vivid flash, as if the very air had been transported to Kandahar. Black smoke in the sky. Screams cutting through the radio. Desperate men taking shelter behind destroyed walls. Major Grady, much younger, running from one trench to another, dragging wounded men on his shoulders. Feet sinking into the hot sand, hands bloody, face covered in dirt and gunpowder. And then, in a moment of complete darkness, he shouted to the troops, "Get up, now, I'll go ahead." Those were the 5 words. 5 words that lifted men off their feet, who reversed the course of a mission doomed to failure, who prevented a massacre. 5 words that came back today, decades later, in the silence of a room where he was humiliated, to show that dignity, when it is real, is not lost over time. Just hide. And one day, he comes back. The lieutenant even tried to justify, cite regulations, claim compliance with orders. But it was interrupted by the man in uniform, by the reporter, by the disconcerting silence that came from the very agents under his command. "You just handcuffed a national hero." The sentence echoed without the need for an echo. It was a stamp. One final point. One is enough. And then the neighborhood fell silent. Outside, neighbors who had previously only looked in were now standing side by side. Some with their arms crossed, others with full eyes. Children being pulled by their mothers, as if they sensed that something important had happened. Something that, even without understanding, they should respect. There was respect in the air, but also shame. As if everyone there knew that they had let too much time pass without recognizing who was walking among them. Write it in the comments. There are truths that no one can erase. Because this story still has something deep to reveal, and it goes far beyond what it seems. The sidewalk, once empty, was now full of faces. People from the neighborhood, from other streets, some who didn't even know the name of the man in the house on the corner, but who were there. They came for the buzz, they stayed for the silence, and when they saw that man, that old man in a bathrobe, handcuffed earlier, now standing up, with his head raised and his hands free, everyone understood, without a single word needing to be said, that they were facing something rare, something you don't see every day. The scene was delicately brutal. The veteran's wife, who until then had been a shadow amidst the chaos, now walked slowly towards him. Every step was a struggle between relief and outrage. When she reached him, she enveloped him in a hug that wasn't just one of comfort, but one of reconnection. As if after decades, she could finally touch him, not as the silent husband, but as the whole man, the soldier, the leader, the hero the world tried to erase. "Yes," she cried. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was pride. That kind of pride that breaks your chest with so much pressure. And he, for a brief moment, allowed himself to close his eyes and feel that embrace with his soul. The sounds of the world disappeared. There were no police, no accusations, no war, just her. And what was left of the two after everything they endured together? It was at that moment that a boy approached. He must have been around 10 years old, with simple clothes, a backpack on his back, and curious but attentive eyes. Without saying anything, he reached out his hand, where he held a small crumpled paper. A note written in blue pen and childish handwriting. "Thank you for not forgetting who you are." The veteran read the sentence, and for a second, he weakened. What those words carried was more than gratitude. It was a mirror. Because he himself had already begun to forget. I had already doubted so many times whether it was worth it. If all that silence, those sleepless nights, that weight on your shoulders, still had any value. With teary eyes, he reached into his coat pocket and took out a small metallic object wrapped in a piece of aged cloth. It was the mission badge, an ancient symbol. It was worth nothing on the market, but it carried the kind of value that can't be bought. The kind that is forged in sweat, mud, loss and promises made in the midst of chaos. He bent down to the boy's height and said, in a low but firm tone, "Now, you're the one carrying this." The boy's hand was shaking, but he accepted. And when he touched the badge, something changed in his face. As if he understood that it wasn't just a gift, it was an inheritance, a reminder, a legacy. And in that instant, something almost invisible happened. The surrounding adults, one by one, began to stand up. Some took off their caps. Others placed their hands on their chests. Nobody asked. Nobody commanded. It was instinctive. It was as if everyone at the same time had felt the weight of that surrender. As if they were silently acknowledging that they had judged too much, listened too little, and that there was before them a man who never asked for glory, just respect. And that was glory. The uniformed man who had led the arrival of the veterans stood at attention. The red eyes. There was nothing left to prove. The truth was before them. Not just about who Major Thomas Grady was, but about what he represented. A generation that learned to endure silence, who faced horrors that many could not bear to hear. And yet he returned home, built a family, raised children, smiled at birthday parties, all while carrying ghosts that no one saw. This is the kind of transformation that doesn't make the headlines. It's the transformation that happens inside. That shapes the mentality. That reveals the true strength of a human being. Because the true weight of courage is not in the scream. It is in the resistance. And if there's one thing this story shows clearly, it's that behind every closed door, there could be a giant sleeping. A giant who does not need public recognition or medals on display. It just needs to be remembered. It just needs to be seen. Comment there. I see who no one sees. Because there is still more of this story stored in the hearts of those who never wanted the spotlight, but always carried the light with them. The afternoon was slowly beginning to die in the sky, turning the edges of the clouds orange as the light gently filtered through the living room windows. The house, so agitated hours before, now seemed to breathe at a calmer pace. The sofa had returned to its place. The broken cups had been collected, and the emotional marks that previously echoed through the walls had given way to something rare: peace. On the coffee table, the tea that had cooled was still there, untouched since that first moment of chaos. But now, the veteran and his wife were sitting together, side by side, each with their cup in their hands. She drank in silence, looking at him with a kind of tenderness that only years can sustain. He, on the other hand, kept his eyes focused on the window. And what I saw outside wasn't just a group of neighbors still gathered together. It was something bigger. People standing, some sitting on the sidewalk, others still trying to understand exactly what they had witnessed. It was as if time out there had been suspended by something you don't see every day. A simple man, with an extraordinary past, finally recognized. Not by decree, not by headline, but by the silent force of truth that, when it comes, does not need to impose itself. It just exists. The veteran smiled at the corner of his lips. But it wasn't an easy smile, the kind you give out of politeness. It was the kind of smile that carried pain and relief at the same time. He still didn't have the words to explain how he felt. Not after all. Public humiliation. The invasion of your home. The memories that came back like a storm. And now, that strange comfort that came from belated recognition. His right hand was shaking slightly. Not out of fear, but because of age, which inevitably takes its toll over time. He looked at his fingers, as if trying to remember how many times he had held a weapon, held a wounded comrade, or written a letter he never had the courage to send. Every wrinkle on that hand was a living memory, even when he no longer wanted to remember. And that's when he spoke. Low, almost in a whisper, as if he didn't want to disturb the silence of the moment. They think heroes scream, but the ones who did the most never needed to raise their voices. His wife looked at him with teary eyes. There was something sacred about that phrase, something that had no place in patriotic speeches or shiny decorations. It was a truth that few people are ready to accept. The greatest acts of courage almost always happen in anonymity, behind the scenes, far from the applause, in the cold of sleepless mornings, in the years when you carry everything, without ever having the chance to tell it. He carefully placed the cup on the table, slowly got up, and went to the door. He opened it and stood there, just watching. The people, seeing him, stood up again. No applause, no noise, just respect. The kind of respect that is built in the soul, not on the surface. The old major raised his hand slightly in a simple gesture, but one that said it all. Not as someone who says goodbye, but as someone who delivers. And there, on that balcony, with the sunset illuminating his time-marked features, he said the last words that would echo not only on that street, but in the hearts of everyone who witnessed that story. Silence is also a way of serving. And with a last firm look, still with the golden light touching his face, he added, "Now, it's your turn to continue the mission." Because some stories don't end with a period. They continue in every person touched, in every mind transformed, in every decision that chooses honor over pride. Comment there. I continue the mission, because if this journey has crossed you in any way, it has already started within you. If you've come this far with me, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing this moment with me. It wasn't an easy story, but maybe it was exactly what we needed to hear today, right? If it made sense to you, leave it here in the comments. That message was for me. Knowing that you stayed with me until the end makes all the difference, because that's exactly what gives meaning to what I share here. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, consider subscribing now, because content like this only makes sense when it reaches you. When we create this true connection, this exchange that transforms not only our mentality, but also our journeys. Also, leave a like if this story touched you in any way. This small gesture means a lot, and shows me that I'm on the right path. Oh, and before I forget, there's a video here that complements everything we talked about. Click on it now and stay with me there, because there are more important things waiting for you.